Hey everyone. So today I want to talk to you about poetry in libraries, and specifically to highlight the potential in building a poetry chapbook collection. Now, poetry often occupies a marginal place in libraries and in the publishing market. Other than a handful of classics and bestsellers, most poetry stays in narrow circulation, mainly read by other poets. But the idea that nobody reads poetry doesn't necessarily hold true. A report by the Poetry Foundation, released in 2006, surveyed adult readers across the United States, and 94% of these respondents had interacted with poetry at some point in their lives. For some, that might have been only in school or at a special event, but there was no magic demographic factor that turned people into dedicated poetry readers. Poetry readers were statistically no different from readers in general. They had simply encountered poetry at some point that spoke to them and chose to continue pursuing it. And one difference they did find, poetry readers were even more likely than readers in general to be library card holders. And the report also highlights social dimensions to poetry. Poetry readers like to share poems with friends by lending books through email, and this is easier than ever these days. Poetry can be shared and even published on social media. And 2017 stats from the American Endowment for the Arts suggest that poetry readership has increased alongside the rise of social media use. So, chances are there are people in your library who are interested in poetry, but they're often not getting poetry from library shelves. A study of a Canadian poetry community found that they supported the library, but many of them didn't utilize the poetry collection very much. Increased variety and currency of the collection were some suggestions they had, as well as increased visibility and promotion of poetry. Often libraries, seeing limited budgets and a limited audience for poetry, tend to stick to collecting safe bets like classics and prize winners. But poetry can be a powerful medium for representing everyday experience, how it feels to live in your community in this time, or as a person with specific identities and experiences. And to better capture this aspect of poetry, without breaking the bank, I'd like to argue that collecting poetry chapbooks is the way to go. So, what is the chapbook? A chapbook is basically just a book that's under 48 pages long. The form's been around pretty much as long as the printing press, and it has a history as a cheap way of sharing everything from sensational fiction to political manifestos with the masses. And these days, the books are usually still low cost, but the typical use has shifted from mass media to limited runs of experimental work. This new version of the chapbook became especially prevalent with increased access to copying technology in the 1960s, but it's become a common way of publishing poetry ever since the 1800s. Chapbooks these days might be published by small, grant-funded presses. They might be winners of a contest by a literary magazine. They might be self-published, either in print or online. The poetry chapbook tends to be most associated with new poets, for whom it can act as a kind of social currency, a sample of their creative identity that they can circulate among other poets, maybe sell at poetry readings and other events. But established poets may also choose the chapbook form if they have a long poem or a themed sequence they want to publish, if they're trying out a different style, or if they want a more rich design of the book itself. And I did check out a few examples from the University of Alberta library, just to show you the diverse directions that a poetry chapbook can take. So the first sample I have here is an example where the chapbook form is really about having almost an artist book level of design. This book was published by a small literary press on Salt Spring Island, and the book is one long poem, which is kind of lamenting the encroachment of industry and money on this small island community. So in this case, the book is really part of the poem. It celebrates nature with photos that are included. It slows your reading of the piece as you handle the book. And it's in this limited edition, handmade form that's kind of antithetical to the hustle of capitalist society that she's decrying. Another example is this collection of poems by Alejandro Albarrán Blanco, published by Ugly Duckling Press in Brooklyn, New York. So this is another literary press, and they use this chapbook series to present work in translation. So in this case, the chapbook is a low-cost way of presenting a sample of work that might be popular in one country, but is unknown to the English-speaking audience. And in this case, they've created an interesting object too. If you turn it around, you can also read it in the original Spanish. And in this case, the poetry itself is quite experimental. There are prose poems and found elements, and also a little bit of a visual poem here. But a major value of the chapbook is that it can move beyond the literary mainstream and publish marginalized perspectives as well. So one example of this that I found was Downtown East Side Poems by Sandy Cameron. And this was published by Lazara Press, which is a one-person operation dedicated to distributing alternative work. And the Downtown East Side, if you don't know, is a very old and very low-income neighborhood in downtown Vancouver, and it kind of typifies a lot of the social tensions in the city. But the poems here describe day-to-day life. They describe changes and tensions in the neighborhood. They make a record of community events. They share artwork from a community chalk drawing event. And being able to share these sympathetic voices on politicized issues like homelessness is really important in the moment. But it's also interesting in that by the library preserving this book, that was published in 1998, it gives a historical record as well. And it can show us that this tension between gentrification and community care really hasn't changed all that much in the past 15 years. But on a bit of a lighter note, when I was picking up these books, I also came across this chapbook being distributed for free in the library. They call this a community poetry project, and it's published by the university, collecting poems on the theme of happiness from the university community. And it's another aspect of chapbooks that I wanted to highlight, which is that they're really easy to make. So not only can libraries collect and preserve chapbooks, they can also provide publishing avenues themselves. One really interesting project I came across was an outreach project by Wayne State University to a local high school, where they had students create poetry chapbooks as a digital literacy project. These students learned to use all the software involved. They learned how to use the real university repository, and then they also got to share their poetry in both a reading at the end and by having it available, all of their chapbooks, in the repository for people to read. So this is really just the tip of the iceberg, but what I'm hoping this illustrates is that chapbooks can be an avenue for revitalizing a poetry collection that really maximizes the impact of your purchases. When people have negative perceptions of poetry, these are often that it's boring, that it's difficult to engage with, that it's old-fashioned or out of touch. And chapbooks really represent the opposite of that. They represent new voices, experimental work. They can be easily read in one sitting and often have specific themes or visually eye-catching elements that might interest people who wouldn't otherwise read poetry. The difficult part is really just deciding how to build the collection. So if you have an active poetry community in your city, going to local readings, looking up local publishers, it's a great place to start. The poets will be glad for your support, and this can open doors to hosting events in the library as well, to further cross-pollinate the poetry and library communities and promote your new collection. If you don't have much to draw on locally, drawing on online resources to find works on a particular theme that you think is underserved in your library could be another way to go. If you give yourself a specific goal of selecting, for example, works on the LGBTQ experience, this can just make it a little easier to sift through the very large wealth of material that is out there. And if your focus is on increasing the presence of local voices or on community engagement, collaborative projects might be the way to go. This could be anything from providing a repository and digitization services for local chapbook writers to share and preserve their work, to hosting workshops where people actually create chapbooks on site. And if you're not too familiar with poetry, just trust your instincts. The whole point of sharing emerging work is that there isn't a big critical consensus yet on what's good. something strikes you as engaging, someone else will probably find it interesting too. And how you present this collection will help with the impact as well. There are lots of similarities between chapbook and zine collecting that you can look to. For example, a browsing section or a magazine type display is one way to highlight the work and keep it from getting missed in the stacks. Digital initiatives, as I've mentioned, go well with the chapbook. In particular, since chapbooks are often limited in their distribution, you may end up having books in your collection that are hard to find elsewhere, so digitization can help you reach a wider audience with that. Being sure to catalog the books with unique subjects of interest will help, as can creating guides to the collection that give good entry points, highlight themes, or even connect your collection with works that are shared freely online elsewhere. So, I hope I've convinced you that the poetry chapbook is unique, of the moment, and lends itself well to community building. Add that to a low price tag, and you get a great avenue for adding currency and unique value to poetry collections in all kinds of library contexts. In the handout, I've provided details on some of the articles and books I drew on here, as well as some links to publishers and repositories, just as a starting point for where chapbooks can be found. So, thanks for watching, and I hope you get the chance to read a little poetry today.